So good evening again. It is I, Nick, Pennsylvania, here with my good friend Brendan Bond.
Hey, everybody.
And we are here with a new person, first time really speaking with, named Rob Phoenix, a person I'm very interested in speaking with. I'm going to let him loose here in just a minute, but I kind of wanted to give just a quick backstory. Those of you who are listening to this on Ghost Furnace may not yet be aware, but Bond and I for a number of years have talked about Pennsylvania's unique history and folklore and really just very Pennsylvania-centric podcast with Dr. Pennsylvania. And quite a number of years ago, one of the topics researched and spoke about was the Hex murders, which are somewhat infamous story what occurred in the southern central Pennsylvania region out by York back in the 1920s. And just about a month ago, Rob, who is with us this evening, had commented on that video and reached out, and just a conversation started going. And I thought, well, this is a person that has a unique knowledge of this living tradition and knowledge, and it would be much more worth our time to listen to him speak about this. So, Rob, I've said a few things, but would you like to kind of explain to people yourself and this tradition that you're in?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate it. So yeah, my name's Rob Phoenix. I live in South Central Pennsylvania, and I'm what's known as a powwow. Some people call it a powwow doctor, a powwow practitioner. Locally, I'm known as the powwow guy. Just to kind of jump off of what you were talking about, I was just sort of scrolling through YouTube and I came across somebody talking about the Hex murder, and I thought, that's really cool. This is a really interesting local story, a very real event that happened in the late 1920s here in South Central Pennsylvania, and it involved a couple of powwow doctors and a local witch. So it's a really fascinating story. It's part of our history. It's part of our cultural history. And I feel such a connection to some of the players in the story. So I was really pleased and impressed to hear somebody talking about it correctly, without all the silliness that can get added onto stories and legends over time. So yeah, I was really glad I heard that. I think it's important to keep things alive, or at least keep history alive, keep truth out there so it doesn't get muddied, because things can get muddied over time. And that's how I am with my powwowing practice. So is that kind of where you want we should talk about that a little bit? Or
yeah, that's a good introduction for anybody that's not familiar with the Hex murders. Again, I thank you for the endorsement. Did a lot of research on that, and I would look into that. But also, you were yourself featured in a documentary on the subject that both Brendan and I watched. I thought it was very well done and a pretty balanced take. Do you want to give the name of that documentary?
Yeah, so the movie is called Hex Hollow: Witchcraft and Murder in Pennsylvania. It was released in 2015. The magic of Hollywood is that my pieces were filmed, some in July 2013 and some in July 2015. It's kind of interesting. Chris Bellardi was another powwow practitioner in that film. All of his parts were filmed at my house. They filmed him in my backyard, in my kitchen. They filmed the back of my house right before they showed him to kind of give the impression that was his house. It was all this kind of Hollywood magic. So it's pretty cool.
It's a very nice porch that you had in my memory.
Oh, that's my front porch. Yeah, that's our sanctuary. But so anyway, it was a lot of fun. I definitely check it out, but I will let everybody know it's free online on a channel called Tubi, Tubi, but it was also on Amazon or wherever. So anyway, yeah, don't pay for it. You can watch it for free. Highly recommend it. Great story.
So for a lot of people, and I don't believe this was my first introduction to the idea, because I've lived in Pennsylvania for a long time. There's a lot of the Pennsylvania German around here, and the Pennsylvania Deutsch, more often known as Amish, in our region of Western Pennsylvania as well as Central Pennsylvania. I first became aware of this culture through a book, The Verborgen Freund, The Long Lost Friend. I may be under a misconception of how important that book plays a role. I feel like because it's often presented as being the book, then it's probably not. It's probably just a book. But when you say Pennsylvania Powwow Doctor, that's where I think all the misconceptions begin, because I think it's been presented to people who come across it by way of the hex murders and because of the accusations that somebody had hexed or bewitched a couple gentlemen, that this is some sort of witchcraft. But it, at least the long lost friend, as Brendan and I understand it, and we have our copies, is it's really a series of folk remedies, natural healings, prayer. There's even a few recipes in the book. When you explain powwow to people as it is today, how do you explain it to people?
To kind of understand the long lost friend, you kind of have to, I kind of have to go a little bit into history, but I'll be brief and clear, I promise. When the Europeans, the German-speaking immigrants started coming to Pennsylvania for religious freedom, and by that, it was the Catholics ruled. And so the non-Catholics, the Protestants, the Mennonite, and then later the Amish, they all wanted to get away from the German Reformed. And so they had bits of Catholicism that they liked, the sort of the folky magical bits, the Catholics are very magical tradition with their talismans and their praying to saints and lighting certain candles for certain things and such with. So they liked all that. And Europe was pretty much ripe with magical traditions. All this, and it was all this Christian-based kind of folk spells and charms for healing and such with. So they brought all that with them. And so here in Pennsylvania, they were using these things, but it was largely oral tradition. A mother would teach a son, or, a grandfather would teach a granddaughter, whatever, how to work these cures and charms and healing rituals and such, and pass that on, verbally. And so by the early 1800s, when John George Homan decided to publish a book, it was the first grimoire ever written in our country. But it was also the first time anything of our tradition was put into writing, and here in the United States. So, some people didn't like that because it really is more of an oral tradition. And while the long lost friend does have, some of the things that the oral tradition used, there's so much more that's not included in that book. So the book was really helpful because it put the tradition into everybody's hands, and all John George Homan was saying is, if you believe in God, and you can put this to work for you. So everybody and their brother had a copy of The Long Lost Friend. It was as common as the Bible. And people were using these rituals and charms to heal their family and such in a time when we didn't have emergency, medical facilities, or whatever they're called, urgent care centers and such with.
So this is a seminal book then. It's not just my misconception because so much attention being paid to it in the context of the Russmeyer story. So
yeah, it was very widely. They said it's, it's been in continuous print since 1819.
That's that I did not know. I did read somewhere that it was one of the first grimoires, and certainly the first in the country. You had said that some of the people in the community didn't take very quickly to it, an oral tradition kind of being written down. Do you know of any other antagonism within the community? Because again, we're talking about Pennsylvania. I know the town that I used to live in, just a few miles between Brendan and I, was actually started by a religious utopian set, Father Rapp, Johannes Rapp, here in southwestern Pennsylvania. and the Mennonites came in afterwards. But of course, there's also the Quakers, whose shadow casts long over the history of Pennsylvania. And very recently, we looked at a story, the historic origins of the Jersey Devil, and how much of that was started by skirmishes within the Quaker community about the publishing of astrological things in a Quaker publication. Are you aware of any other skirmishes or any other contention with regard to this book with other religious communities in the Pennsylvania region?
I can't, not really. I really can't say yes or no in regards to that, because over time that book became the face, the book of the tradition. And whereas at one time it was largely the oral tradition, and then a lot of people were picking up the Long Lost Friend, over time it became Powwowers all had a copy of the Long Lost Friend. And it wasn't the Raymar incident definitely had an impact, because at that time when Nelson Raymar, who was a powwow was everywhere. They say there was a powwower on every street corner, and some powwowers actually had offices that you could make an appointment and go to, and some were charging for their services, which a lot of people are against that, but they were doing it. So it was very widespread. And then when Nelson Raymar was murdered, the media sensation over this, put this big spotlight on Pennsylvania, and people thought, what are these crazy people doing? They're talking about witches and spells and everything else. And so how the media can turn the social opinion on a dime, and all of a sudden people are like, yeah, this powwow's dumb, this is ridiculous, boo to powwowers. So powwow kind of went underground. People stopped talking about it. And that's when you had that period from like 1930 to like 1970. People didn't want to talk about it at all. Maybe they'd secretly do it, or maybe the people who were doing it would take up massage therapy or veterinary medicine so they could still do it, but with a scientific foundation. So yeah, even like you'll see in a lot of the Mennonites, in the Mennonite community, you'll find people that are doing herbal remedies or acupuncture, that sort of thing. But at one time they may have been doing powwow, and now this is their socially acceptable way of doing it.
So I have one more big question before I need to make sure to hand things over to Brendan a little bit, who I know has got a bunch of questions. I don't want to monopolize this, but that's a perfect segue. Is that how did you become interested in it? How old were you? Did you have a mentor? Was this something that you were already familiar with, or was this something that you learned in some way and then just became involved in?
Growing up, so in the late 70s, early 80s, we had heard of a local powwower, and she was in a town called Catawissa, which was about 6 or 7 miles from where I lived. And so I was a kid. It was in probably the early 80s. And the rumor was that she had cured somebody of leukemia. Now, in the 80s, I don't know if either of you were around in the 80s, but leukemia was kind of I don't want to say this, it was kind of like popular. It was like all the after school special kids had leukemia, and it was just kind of,
it was right before AIDS became really big. And so
yeah, kidnapping was still kind of chic. But so that was in the 80s. We had heard of a local powwower who had healed somebody, and so we knew what powwow was, but people didn't really think that much about it. It was just kind of, okay, cool, there's a powwower. Nobody cared either way. And then in the late 1980s, I was at the bank with my mom, and we were having this freak ice storm in like May. I barely remember it, but we were in the bank, and there was this gentleman talking to this lady or something. Like I said, I can hardly remember. And he said, yeah, this is that damn powwower up Catawissa. And I thought, that's fascinating that a powwower can create an ice storm. And I thought, that appeals to me. I want to be able to do that. So I just became fascinated in the whole idea of this idea of magic, folk magic, and powwow. And there was no, you didn't have, like, our local library obviously didn't have anything. And, I didn't have anybody to ask. And so as I got older and I started going to bookstores and such, the only thing I could find was books about, like, witchcraft. And in the later 1990s, I met somebody she was publicly claiming herself as a witch, but also saying she taught powwow. And so that was fascinating to me. And I started learning from her and joined this group and everything. And then by 2003, I realized that it was not powwow. It was really just like modern witchery. Wasn't for me. And so I just kind of went out on my own. And I started, by then there was internet. I started reaching out to like more academic people, finding more books and such, and just like begging anybody and everybody to teach me what they could. So by 2008, I had a pretty good education in what powwow really was. I had learned from a lot of different people, a lot of just private individuals or people I met through church, or I know a lady who knows a lady kind of situation. And then I just started putting myself out there. So that's it. And I've had no negative reception. It's very socially acceptable, I guess, because it is a Christian tradition, and in this day and age, there's so many like kind of alternative things that if somebody sees, well, this is a Christian thing, it's not as weird. It's something a lot of people are familiar with. I do get a lot of people that say, wow, I haven't seen a powwow since I was a little kid. My grandmother took me to a powwow, so this is really fascinating that there are still people out there. So yeah, I've had nothing but really, positive reception to it. So
I did kind of want to ask, I know Brendan, unless you got something right away. Okay. Brendan has given me the okay sign. When we were communicating in emails, you did say, because there was somebody that was critical of on YouTube of the Hex murder story that we presented, and didn't really give any reasons why. And one of the things that you had thought, well, it may be because there's a lot of the term used was neo-pagans that see the powwow as being more closer to people's perception of modern witchcraft, where it's very much a reverence for nature, but it's without a background in Christianity. I am kind of curious about that division. And do you think the re-emerging interest and openness into it, you point to the 70s, is tied in with the New Age and kind of a revitalized interest in, again, reverence for nature and looking into maybe what some would call alternatives to main organized religions?
I think that whole New Age movement and the whole neo-pagan idea and such certainly had a role to play in inspiring people to say, oh, well, you're talking about magic or whatever. Well, Pennsylvania actually kind of has our own folk magic tradition. The Pennsylvania Dutch culture has this old folk Christian healing thing. A couple of problematic things, though, about that is that the 90s saw this rise in a lot of misinformation. A lot of people saying, oh, my grandmother was a witch, you know what I mean? And like all this false history. I mean, that's just, let's call it what it is. And unfortunately, a lot of people believe that because they really wanted to, and they still adhere to that to this day. And so when I say, oh yeah, powwow has many anti-witchcraft charms, these modern witches are like, that's offensive. Well, witchcraft didn't mean what it does now. It meant something very different prior to the Llewellyn Publishing Company. There's really not really any talking to that, that kind of individual. So, people want powwow to be something what they want it to be. And powwow has a history. It's one of the best recorded traditions in the world. I mean, we have everything in writing, from a time even when it was an oral tradition. And, it is what it is. People want to make it what they want to, but, we do have an actual recorded history. So I think it's cool that there are a lot of really neat modern traditions now. Magic, people are doing magic and folk magic by whatever name they call themselves. And there's all these different belief systems and such. I think that's great, but I think history should be left alone.
Brendan, you have to have something because the people are going to start thinking you turned into a plant.
So I got all kinds of questions. I want to let you get yours out of the some of yours out of the way first. So this is all fascinating. So one of the questions I have, as far as like you mentioned earlier, like the academic side of things, it sounds like you kind of came into this because you were curious. It was something that was local, and you kind of took a path to get where you are right now. It sounds like, which does seem different, because whenever I read a lot of the books that we've read, like I just finished reading a book by Thomas White that covered a lot of the book was called I think it's just called Witches of Pennsylvania. And a big part of it was a lot of the misconceptions around Powwow and the Ray Meyer Hollow hex murders and everything. Whenever he was kind of giving his background of Powwow, he made it sound like a lot of times it was passed down from a older generation to a younger generation, and usually like cross sexes, like from like a grandfather to a granddaughter or vice versa. How do you feel that your experience has been different having to come to Powwow versus something that you kind of like grew up being kind of brought into?
Well, it's a good question. I would say my experience learning has been long and hard. Long because my interest was sparked in the late 1980s when there was nothing, And then it's not that I spent every waking moment of my life seeking this out. I went through that period in your early 20s where you screw up your life daily. So I had to go through that for a couple of years. I'm almost out of it. But the problem then for me was trying to find proper information. And at first, the information I was given, I believed because I wanted to believe, and I was wrong. So when I finally realized it was not what it should be, and I was approaching these academics, I was not taken seriously by them. I said it was like, at the time, I felt like I had marks on me against my credit or something.
Because again, how do you, when you don't know, how do you validate? And you make a very good point. When you want to believe something, you accept it. I've started to realize, like, the more I want to believe something's true, the more likely it is not to be.
Yeah, it's just, you really, you latch on, somebody's offering you this thing you've wanted for so long. I struggled a lot, whereas I didn't have, a grandmother saying, it's your time to learn, I had to beg people. So yeah, but you're absolutely right. It was more common, like in a family, it would be same gender sometimes or cross gender.
You mentioned that whenever nowadays, when you're performing your practice and everything, and you've had, it sounds like an overwhelmingly positive experience talking to most folks about your practice. What would you say are, I don't even want to say they're maybe good or bad, but what are some of the misconceptions in either direction that you find most people have about modern practitioners of this craft?
I think a lot of people really, and a lot of people, I would say, really struggle to understand that something is dependent on your faith in God. Many times, I can't even pinpoint an exact time, but many times I've said, well, it's not me that does the work, it's God that does the work. And they're saying, oh, like a placebo. No, it's like God that does the work. Oh, like Reiki. No, I'm not blasting any power from my hands or anything. It's God that does the work. I do the motions, the words, and everything else, and God affects the healing. And so people have a really hard time wrapping their head around that, but it's a different world we live in from back in the day, and where people believed in God as almost a necessity. It was just part of being a person. You believed in God. You understood that God was there. And it's not even so much that you believed it, you just knew, and nowadays things are different. So that's why I say powwow is not for everybody, because you kind of have to be able to get there, you kind of have to be able to say, I am not the end all and be all. I am not God. There is a God, and it's just the way it is. So that's the biggest. I don't know if it's a misconception, but the biggest thing that people have a hard time understanding about the tradition. And so when I say that's just the way it is, people say, well, you're a religious zealot. I don't understand why an atheist can't do it. Well, do something different then, just leave it alone. But yeah, that's the biggest thing. That's the biggest source of contention for people, is when I say this is a Christian tradition. And, you have to believe. You have to believe in God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit, and it just is what it is. I didn't create it. So
No, that's interesting, because I think that kind of goes in, like, that misconception, I think, falls right in line with the other misconceptions we were kind of mentioning earlier that do align it more with like ritual magic or witchcraft, where people assume it has a more like objective course of actions, where it's like you do A, B, and C, and then D happens, which is what it sounds like people want sometimes. And what you're saying is it is a little more subjective. It has a lot more to do with your belief in it, both from a practitioner standpoint, but also the person who is the beneficiary, if you will. And you've mentioned kind of the whole New Age movement a few times in relation to like the 70s, especially, and everything. Do you think that as a result of like the New Age movement and just like kind of like where we are socially now, do you think powwow is more accepted because of those actions, or is it less accepted because of like science, I guess, and how people's current perceptions are of what is quote unquote real?
Okay, I think that's a good question. If I'm understanding it, I think I am. When I've done talks about powwow at historical societies or local events and such, they always attract the older folks. We did an event at the William Penn Museum, I don't know, 8 maybe years ago. It attracted so many of the older folks who grew up in a Pennsylvania Dutch home. They were very accepting of it, in part because there's so much silliness out there, or there's so much weirdness out there. And like coming from their perception, not just mine, but the older folks, I mean, I'm 50, but these are folks a lot older than me, which they see as silly. They don't understand all that running around and using whatever. So to see powwow, which is familiar to them, which they grew up with, which they trusted, which they know has, the people that I've seen in church, they know that it's the real deal. So they're very accepting of it, part of that nostalgia element, I think. So there is a lot of that. It's very accepted because of that. But the modern magical community is very unaccepting of it insofar as it being a Christian tradition, because they want to take it apart and use it for their own. You know what I mean? And because I say, well, don't do that. You say you're doing something ancient, just do that. But leave powwow alone. Well, they don't like that, and I'm not very welcome in that community. And I'm okay. I don't do my work for those people.
Right.
Do it.
Well,
right.
I do feel like it's a very modern thing to want to pick things from these. There's a lot of cultural exchange, and we want to pick something from here and something from here. And there's pushback on that too. And I feel like this is one of those things where what I see, as you're saying, is like this is a thing. It's established, as you said earlier. We have a long, well documented history. You take exception to people wanting to take bits and pieces of it and kind of construct a separate thing with it in a way, because you can't totally remove something from where and when it comes from, I feel like, if that's making sense. Yeah. One of the things that's interesting to me, though, we made it very clear, and in our documentary talking about the Rustmeyer incident, we made it clear that this is a Christian history of folk magic, of faith healing, of herbal remedy that really evolved over hundreds of years. One of the things that I find curious, though, is that the Mennonites, who are Protestant, the publisher of The Long Lost Friend, Catholic, it seems to me that if there's any one unifying thing, it's that it's the Pennsylvania German stock. And again, at the time when the book was published and when these traditions are kind of coming into it in America, Germany itself is not a thing. And it's my understanding that the term Pennsylvania Deutsch comes from a time when any German speaking person was known as being Deutsch or Deutsch. And so we're talking about people from the Prussian side of things, people from really just a wide area of kind of that gate to Central Europe. Am I correct in saying as much, or are there other kind of ethnic communities that are under the umbrella of what we would call Pennsylvania powwow?
Well, the Pennsylvania Dutch are essentially the German-speaking immigrants that came here prior to the establishment of Germany.
Yeah, which is like 1869, 1870, I want to say.
Correct. So the German-speaking immigrants that came after that are known as Pennsylvania German. Well, now we just use the words interchangeably because everything's so mixed up and mingled now.
I think I just did. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's okay. It is what it is. My great grandparents came from Austria in like 1864, 65, you know what I mean? And they're from Austria, but they were German speaking, obviously. So, but it was always Pennsylvania Dutch in my family. Everybody always said Pennsylvania Dutch. Now, time-wise, they're on the cusp, I guess. I don't know. What are they Dutch? Are they German? It's all the same. But yeah, you're right. It's Pennsylvania Dutch is considered from this time to this time, and then after that, it's Pennsylvania German. And then there's also just German. Those are the people that didn't stay here and just kind of, west, whatever way is west for your point of view, but which being the largest nationality in our country, is German. So anyway, I forget the question now. If that hopefully.
I guess it really wasn't so much of a question, so much as it's kind of a recognition that for me, it's interesting that we see something that, regardless of Christian sect, within the German-speaking community, powwow seems to be pretty widely accepted because, again, you've mentioned Mennonites. We've mentioned that Holman was himself a German Catholic.
Holman was a Catholic. It's largely now practiced in like Lutheran or what's left of German Reformed.
One of the follow-up questions I have on that is, you mentioned a few times you've said you've used the term "we." I don't, because this is something I know nothing about, in the sense of how many folks would you say are out there that are actively practicing?
There are a pretty good amount of powwowers, not like there were back in the day. There's, I know another one in my town, just 2 streets up. Now him and I don't communicate with each other. Powwow is very territorial. I always say that. If you know of another powwower, you kind of don't take clients or patients, whatever you want to call it, from their area. That's their area. So there are, there's one in New Cumberland, which is about 2 miles from me. I don't know. We're still out there. They're still out there. I've personally taught about 30 people. Out of them, active powwowers, there's probably 6 or 7. So yeah, there's a pretty good amount of us out there. Not like there was, but you can still find a powwower with a little bit of legwork. You know what I mean?
Right. That's it. That's interesting. Because that was one of those things where I'm if you would have asked me beforehand how many folks were practicing in any given county or town, I wouldn't even know where to start. Yeah. So that's interesting. So it's probably more prevalent sounding than what I had at least initially anticipated. That's interesting. Like you mentioned how obviously this is an oral tradition, and there was the long lost friend and everything. was the first time it was kind of written down. Would I be correct in saying that this is different than other Catholic, or like you said, modern day Lutheran churches, in the sense that like there's no like governing body or anything of that nature that like oversees powwow, correct?
Correct. And I think for people like me that want to put information out there and make it more available, so nobody has to go through what I went through for 20 years, where I look is the academic stuff. That's where I look. I look to those people because they have the preserved history. They have the backup for everything I'm saying, you know? So I would say kind of, I consider that to be sort of like, you know, when in doubt, go for the academics because they have the truth of it.
Right. Yeah. When you say truth, you mean source of truth, in the sense that like here is a objective record of what previous, you know, practitioners have written down, or what stories have been collected in that kind of like unbiased fashion, one way or the other. That's interesting. I would say that that is admirable, and I would say that also that that's not common amongst folk traditions, at least from what I've kind of seen from other folks. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Are there any other books that you've encountered? We've mentioned A Long Lost Friend quite a bit. I don't know if there are any books that span that time between the publication of The Long Lost Friend in 1819 and 1920, any books contemporary to that era, or just anything that's come out, anything academic that's come out in the last 40, 50 years?
Okay, so in the time from The Long Lost Friend until about 1920, there were a small handful of folks who wanted to put their own voice in what they call the ongoing conversation. So they kind of like self-published little booklets of charms and such, almost as a response to The Long Lost Friend. So maybe they thought, what's in A Long Lost Friend, like, that's fine, but here's something a little more accurate, you know, that sort of thing. That information is really not available to somebody like me. Now, that's where I rely on the academics. You know, I look to Berks County, the Berks Historical Society, Kutztown University. They have it all. So that's where I look to them for that information, what they're willing to share, at least to see those things. So some people may have had access to that. I'm not sure how widespread that was. And then around the 20s, I'm not sure exactly when, there was a book called The Secrets of Sympathy. That was kind of a book used by powwowers. There was also another powwow book written in the late 1800s called The Osman and Steele Guide to Health, written by a mother and son powwower. But their book was never really very popular. In fact, it became more popular in the Southern Appalachians and started being used by the Appalachian conjure folk. But then in the 80s, I guess, then we started seeing more like more works. Like the first book about the Hex murder was written. Now, since that book in the 80s, so much more has been found out and there's better information available. And in the 90s, David Kriebel wrote, he did like a very academic study of powwowers. I guess late 90s, maybe early 2000s. It's called Powwowing in Pennsylvania. It's an extremely academic work, but he interviewed several powwowers. And then, of course, Patrick Dunmoyer. He's the main academic voice in the tradition and the culture. So anything he writes is top, you know, #1, top notch.
Well, I believe both Brendan and I wrote a bunch of titles and names down for the next time we're at Half Price Books, or whenever I'm in the Harrisburg area. I'm a big fan of Downtown Scholar. If you've never, is it Downtown or Midtown Scholar?
Midtown.
Either way, it's great bookstore. Fantastic. What, Midtown, you say?
Yeah. Overpriced. And I think it's always really warm in there. But yeah.
It is very warm. It's to lull you in. This will
Mhm.
lull you in. And yeah, but you know what? It's one of those places where I'll pay a little more because there's always going to be something in there I didn't realize I couldn't live without.
Yeah, it's just down the street from my office. I
Oh,
work
yeah?
I work downtown Harrisburg. Yeah.
Oh, well, I have an office in downtown Harrisburg too, but I only have to be there like 5 or 6 times in a year. So, and you can imagine over the past few, haven't gotten there all that often, but when I do, that's my
Okay.
go-to place.
Well, let
So
me
I
know.
will be looking
Yeah,
for
we
those.
get together.
I would like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
So,
Go ahead.
when people come to you, what are some of the sources? I imagine there's a lot of things fall under like umbrellas of health and just benefit. What are some of the things that people come to you with?
Most of the time, people contact me because they feel like they have a curse on them, and it's an interesting phenomenon. And where I live, there is an entire clan, a witchcraft clan in this area. So there are a series of local covens. Now, this is all modern witchery and such, but I know a lot of these individuals personally, and I know that a lot of what they do is not very nice and modern and new agey. So when somebody says, well, I feel like I have a curse on me, you might. So that's what I get a lot of people asking me for. Now there's this local company. I think there are a couple, not company, couple, and they're a riot, a gentleman and his wife. And they always show up. I think they watch my house to see when I'm outside working. And then they just come tumbling around, how you doing? And they need some powwow for this or that. So I'll do it for them and then send them home with, the last time they were here, I sent them home with a jar of homemade pickles. They're just this fun couple. They don't have much, but once or twice a year, they just like pop in, they need some powwow and, I'm there for them. A lot of people want me to read cards for them. And I do not I think, well, I've had a lot of people think, oh, don't you read tarot cards? No, I don't do that. I can read playing cards. And people are surprised that, I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but it's really good when I can read the cards for people. But it's not what they're probably used to. I went for a tarot card reading a few years ago and she was asking me all these questions and it was this long, 45-minute ordeal. And I was just so over it. But if I'm doing a reading for somebody, I'm throwing out all the cards. I'm telling them exactly what I see. They don't need to tell me anything. I just throw it out, tell them, there's your information, do with that what you will. And so from those, if people get a reading, then they're like, wow, can you do some powwow for me immediately? And I can. There's no charge for any of that. I don't make any money off of it. So I actually do get a lot out of it though, because sometimes it's just nice to talk to people, or, it makes me feel good that people leave and they do feel good, and I hope it does manifest for them. I say it's all in God's hands. So maybe go home and read the Gospel of Matthew. I sometimes give little homework assignments if I feel the person needs it, because I think that helps,
Well, and you touch upon something that I think is very true. And I personally, and it's not to upset anybody, but I am a much more skeptically inclined person. But one of the things I really truly believe in, whether it's with malicious or beneficial intent, is that what you put out there, your intent, has a lot to do with everything. And when you surround yourself with people, this exchange that you're having with this couple is a wholly positive thing. And I think that's very beneficial. And I believe there's a real beauty in this living tradition, because not only does it serve a very real social function, but it has that reverence for simple things, and it has a sense of community, and it has that humbleness to be. You kind of spoke about this before, to recognize that I'm only doing these motions. There's a greatness beyond, and I'm, as you said, you're not making money doing this, And for me, that's a big thing. Trying to capitalize on everything I do, I think that makes me feel icky. And I think that's one of those things when I see people doing it for a passion and for a love of the subject and of other people, that fills me with a very positive feeling. And it gives me a lot more confidence in a person when I see that. I think we've sometimes been sold this bag of goods that if you do something, you have to make money doing it or something like that. But I feel, again, can come back to what you were kind of touching that made me think about it, is just the positivity, the interaction, the community, you giving people homework, because there's a comfort in that. And it's also, I think, one of the appeals of tarot, and I know Brenda will sometimes pull those cards. I do not, but it's a time for introspection. And I think reading, bits of the Bible, it gives a lot of that. You read it and you read yourself into it, and you try to see what it can tell you about yourself and where you're at right now. And on the other side of that coin, I think there are people out there that delve into witchcraft and other sorts of things that have an antithetical intent. They have a need for power, or at least a perception of power, and that's another one of those things that I lose confidence in people when I feel that they're doing something for those means. That was a little long-winded,
Right.
but that's some of my feelings about all of this.
Right. And well, and I think what you're getting at, Nick, is something that we've seen over a lot of our conversations, both around PA history and folklore, and just looking into all the stuff that we look into on both of these podcasts. And one of the, I think, not to say principles, but one of the things that becomes more and more clear is that good people trying to help other good people for no other reason than it's good seems to be a part of human nature that is inescapable for the right reasons, that's again why I think I like these stories so much, is because of that exact reason. There might be some sad people along the way that are, said power hungry or whatever. That's across all cultures and types of people and time, unfortunately. But there's so much good out there at the same time. And it's interesting hearing your perspective on this, Rob. I think when a lot of people hear, powwow and all this stuff, they think of, again, the hex murders. They think of hex symbols on barns. They think of all the ritual stuff. They think of all of that stuff, when really sounds like it's about what you were just saying. It's just about trying to help people and just generally do good in the world for that purpose.
Yeah, it's a triangulation of community, of faith, and function. It seems to me. I don't know. What are some of your thoughts?
No, that's absolutely right. I think over the years, a lot of people have helped me when I needed it in many ways, whether I needed money or a place to sleep or food or whatever. People have helped me, and knowing that I had nothing to offer in return except my gratitude. And yeah, it's just a humbling feeling. You're very moved by that there's somebody that's really gonna, and if I think it's important that people who have been helped and have been to the rock bottom of life know what it means to need help. And so you can't take something from somebody because you don't know what they're going through. And I think, like we were talking about the homework assignment, some people really want to give you something. They say, please just take $10 or whatever. No, if you really want to do something, go home, read the Gospel of Matthew or Gospel of Mark. And then they feel like they are doing something. I'm glad they're doing that, because by doing that, they'll get a better sense of where I'm coming from. Hopefully they'll get a little touch of faith in there, and and then they feel like they're doing their part. They're not just getting a free handout or whatever. So it's a win-win all around.
All right. Well, Brendan, do you have any final questions? And Rob, do you have anything else you would like to impart on people who are maybe learning about this for the first time?
I would only say that if somebody is interested in learning about Pennsylvania Dutch powwow, I've been working on my website since 2008. I don't make any money if you visit my website, but I would like you to do so because I've been putting stuff on there this is year 15. And I've been working on it for a long time, and it's been a labor of love. And so I would definitely urge you to check it out. And on there I also, and again, I don't make any money from this whatsoever, but I've been making videos. I have over 100 videos that I've made just talking about powwow. So if you want to learn about it, I've been putting that stuff out there. Every time I learn something new, I share it for free. People go, please. I want people to learn it and do it because it's such a great tradition. Like, let's keep it alive and let's keep it what it is, So
and what is that website? Definitely put that out there for people.
Oh, PAGermanpowwow.com.
Awesome. And we'll obviously make sure we have a link to that in the show notes for both of these feeds.
And I just want to say, like, podcasts like this are so important too for the survival of traditions or for the survival of like folk stories and such. That's why, I heard it on your podcast talking about the Hex murder, and I thought I was moved by that. That's fantastic. That's like, such a great way to preserve history and culture and, all the weirdness that is in the world. So I appreciate that. I appreciate you guys.
Oh, well, we really want to thank you for coming on and having this conversation with us, because I've learned a lot, and it's just, it's so interesting to learn about something for the first time and then realize it not only hasn't been around for such a long time, but that it is a living vine that spans across the decades.